Hey, David, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Oh, thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So if you're ready, you can introduce, make some opening words, or just come to your presentation, whatever you wish.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me. So, as you mentioned during the break, my name is David Schwed. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Halborn. We're a cybersecurity company focusing on the convergence of Web 2 and Web 3. But before I jumped in, I want to give a little bit of background about myself, because it'll kind of help shape some of the conversation that we're going to be having, as far as my different perspectives. So prior to joining Halborn, I was the global head of digital assets technology for BNY Mellon. BNY Mellon, if you're not familiar with it, is the largest custodial bank in the world. From a fiat perspective, they custody over $40 trillion. That's trillion with a T. Prior to that, I was the chief security officer for Galaxy Digital. Galaxy Digital, as you know them today, is a merchant bank focusing specifically on digital assets. But when I joined Galaxy Digital, I was probably about employee number 50, and I was the initial chief security officer. So I was tasked with building out the cybersecurity program, again, in a new world where there wasn't necessarily a playbook. So I've worked in some of the, smallest organizations, standing up a new program, to working in some of the largest financial institutions in the world. So that will kind of help shape my conversation of security versus convenience. But I'm ready to jump in.
Cool. I'd better listen to your history for hours, because it's interesting. But let's go to your presentation. You're welcome. The audience is yours.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So before I jump into the slides, there was something in the news fairly recently that I think really brings up this debate, and that was Ledger, the Ledger hardware wallet. And the Ledger hardware wallet, if everyone is not familiar, or specifically with the details, Ledger is a hardware wallet where obviously by design your seeds are supposed to remain within the secure element, and those seeds are by design never supposed to leave that particular device. And we have this challenge in the crypto community of, well, how do I safely and securely back up my seeds? And you can always have a debate with, somebody who's a purist on the cybersecurity side, and they'll tell you, here's all the convoluted ways that we're going to do it. We're going to shard it, some your secret share it, we're going to encrypt it and double encrypt it, and we're going to put it here and protect it with a YubiKey. And you can go down the rabbit hole of different types of protections. But the problem is that's good for cybersecurity professionals or technical folks that understand that terminology that I just said, or even have the capability of doing those things. But if you want worldwide adoption of crypto, we have to figure out a better way in order to back up the seeds. And that's where Ledger decided that they are going to now offer the ability to have this backup recovery service for your seeds. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate of whether or not this is a good idea or bad idea. If you follow me on any of my socials, you'll see my analysis of where I think they potentially went wrong and how I think they can fix it. But this brings up the conversation of security versus convenience. You have the convenience side of how do we back up our seeds? And then we also have the security side of, well, I don't want the ability to have that ever lead a secure element. Now, if you look at the graph that I just displayed, there are diametrically opposed and competing design principles of security versus convenience. The more convenience you have, as you can see, your level of security is going to end up dropping. And then conversely, the highest level of security you have, you're going to have the most inconvenient processes that you have. So, when I mentioned before of backing up your seeds, if you go down the rabbit hole of, Shamir secret sharing and, double encryption and YubiKeys and, maybe putting them offline. And, even I've heard some organizations where they're actually storing, on paper across multiple different continents, from a convenience factor, having to hop on a plane and travel to multiple different continents in order to reassemble a seed is going to take you days, if not weeks, in order to do things like that. So again, from a convenience side, that's low. So the question is, what's the right balance between security and convenience? And that's what we're going to try to talk about today. So from an inadequate security perspective, you're going to lead to hacks. And then what's going to happen is you're going to have less adoption in the community. And then on the other side, if you have this extremely secure environment, you're going to have a bad user experience and you're going to have less adoption. And the question around convenience also doesn't necessarily touch on the user convenience. I'm going to touch on this a little bit later. It's also about convenience for your employees as well. So you don't want to create such a restrictive work environment for your employees that they don't want to come work for your environment. So those are the two challenges on the convenience side, is the usability of your particular product or service, the employee's convenience factor as far as, how they're implementing new technology, versus on the security side. So we're going to discuss, what is that right balance? So the piece that I wanted to really highlight over here is hacks that we're seeing. So Halborn did an analysis, and we discovered last year, I know there's different numbers that are floating around, there was upwards of about $5 billion in 2022 of crypto hacks. And, this might be a controversial statement I'm about to make, but I believe that most of those hacks were very, very easily preventable. While yes, we did have some nation states, and we had the Lazarus Group from North Korea and some bad actors from some other countries. But if you dissect the hacks, and I'm going to go through one in a little bit, you'll see that there are very standard controls that would have easily prevented many of the different hacks. And, we're going to talk about whether they're a Web3 hack or a Web2 hack, and just the controls that we have today, if implemented properly, would have prevented these. Now, what was stopping most of these organizations was the budget concern. What is the budget in order to create this highly restrictive environment? And I can hire multiple different staffs. Like if you take like a segregation of duties type of control, right? So segregation of duties, one of the core cybersecurity principles is I have one person doing one act and one person doing another act. So that way there's not one person controlling the entire life cycle of a particular service. Now, that's very easily to do in a large institution because they have the budget to go hire multiple different staff. So, you have a maker and a checker. Bringing it back to TradFi, taking a very basic concept of a wire transfer, you can hire one employee to initiate wire transfers. You can have another employee to approve the wire transfers, and you can have a third set of group that reviews all wire transfers that were sent out and reconcile them back to a request. So you can kind of spread that across 3 different groups. But if we're working with and I don't want to say startups, but if we're working with relatively young and immature Web3 companies that don't necessarily have the budget or the wherewithal of a large financial institution or a large enterprise company, they're not necessarily going to be able to offer that type of level of controls. And that's why we're seeing some of the largest hacks in the space. It's not necessarily because the technology is relatively insecure. It's due to a lack of budget, and it's also due to just a lack of overall maturity. So on this slide, I have on the left side and I have the right side. On the left side is, the attacks. What are we actually protecting against? And then we have a list of controls of how we can actually go and block some of these things. Now, I'm not going to go through these. That's not the purpose of my discussion. But the purpose here is to show you that on the left side, these are the different types of attacks that we're seeing. And a lot of them are just the standard cybersecurity attacks that we've seen, for the past 30, 40 years in Web 2. Now, yes, there are Web 3 specific types of attacks when you're talking about smart contract vulnerabilities. But most of the major hacks, like if we talk, and the one that I'm going to get into an example is the Axie Infinity hack. The Axie Infinity hack wasn't a Web 3 hack. It was a traditional Web 2 hack with multiple different layers. And we have protections against that. We have controls. So again, the left side is these are the things that we're used to in the Web 2 world. We're used to malware. We're used to ransomware. We're used to social engineering. We're used to SIM card swapping, man-in-the-middle attacks, unauthorized attacks, insider threats, supply chain attacks. Like we just saw with, I don't want to name the name of the specific company, but we just saw a wallet that it looks to appear to be some sort of mix between an insider threat and a supply chain attack, where they pushed down a malicious update, which then exfiltrated everybody's seeds. We've been running against supply chain attacks and insider threats in the traditional TradFi world for years. It's not something that we're necessarily, this is not a new type of attack vector. And then on the right side, these are some of the traditional controls that we have in place that would protect against these, whether it's, privileged access management or using hardware keys, or again, depending on the size of the organization, using actual, FIPS 142 level 2 or level 3 or level 4 compliant, hardware security modules or HSMs, really full on fleshed education and awareness programs, multi-signature transactions, monitoring and alert. That's a big area where I think a lot of organizations are really, I don't want to say turning a blind eye, but not necessarily focusing a lot on, is the monitoring and the alerting of things. Now, one of the beauties of blockchain is the openness and the transparency. And we have the ability to see transactions before they happen. Not to make this a technical discussion, but you can see transactions in the mempool, and you can front run an attack if we see something that's happening. So we have the openness. We just don't have the security operations center that we are typically used to in the TradFi world that we see in the Web3 world. Now, there's a number of amazing Web3 startup or relatively far along in their seed and Series A round that are building monitoring capabilities within the Web3 world. The problem, though, is now we're going on the incident response. So they alert something. Well, now who's going to, actually go and take these alerts and actually do the investigation, and who's skilled enough to actually go from a triaging perspective and stop the bleeding? These are types of processes and controls that are tried and true in the financial world. Like we have security operations center that are 24/7. We have tier 1, we have tier 2, we have tier 3. We have the concept of what's called a threat hunter. So these are fully fleshed out organizations whose job it is to be eyes on glass, to be looking for these types of alerts, have the run books, escalations to level 2, level 3, have those threat hunters that are looking for things that are not getting picked up by alerting tools. I have not seen that type of setup replicated in the Web3 world. So again, a lot of the hacks that we're seeing today, again, controversial statement, I believe are preventable. Now, what are the impact of security measures on adoption? Now, again, I spoke about this a little before, but I just wanted to throw up this slide, just to give another example of the seed phrase. So again, high security, complex security practices is going to lead to lower adoption. So have you ever tried to explain, like I said, a seed phrase, just even the concept of what is a seed phrase to a non-technical person? Oh, you have this magical 24-word or 12-word, and those are, the genesis or the germ of creating your private keys. And, the private keys, that's all you have to back up, because with that seed phrase, we can regenerate the private keys to effectuate a transaction online. They have no idea what that is. So we have to create a user experience where it's somewhat transparent to the user of what's actually happening in the background. Just like we do in TradFi. When you put an ATM card in and you're deducting cash, does anybody understand what payment rails is? Again, unless you're specifically in TradFi and you understand how that works, the payment processors and money transmitter licenses and like all of the regulatory oversight that goes into putting your ATM card in, getting cash out, and the technical backgrounds and the phrase, it's all transparent to the user. They just put the card in, they type in their code, they take the cash out, and they walk away. We have to create a user experience that is like that for the users. Now, on the other side, when we get into the low security, again, now we're going to lead to hacks, negative reputation, lack of trust, and lower adoption. So again, both sides of the house are going to be to lower adoption. Now, let's just say the person doesn't need to understand exactly what's happening, but they understand, okay, that 24 words, I need to back up. Well, that's great. How easy would it be to just put it in a text file and put it in Dropbox? Dropbox is replicated and I have backup. And for extra redundancy, I can write it down on a note on my phone and it's backed up via iCloud. I now have it backed up in Dropbox. I have it backed up in iCloud. It's on my phone. That is literally probably the most convenient way that you can back up your seed phrase. But any security professional, anybody in the industry is, like Homer's doing, is just saying, "Doe, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." So again, what is that right balance that we hit heat? So now when I mentioned before about the ability to prevent all hacks, now this is not necessarily something that I am recommending at all. So I just wanted to bring this up to show that here's a guide to complete security. Now, again, the purpose isn't necessarily to say that people should go implement these things, but is to show that we do have the technical ability to actually implement controls to stop these things. You can have complete isolation. You can have mandatory air gap systems. Now, when we start talking about on-chain transactions, you can't necessarily have the speed to make a transaction if your entire infrastructure is air gapped, which is why now the convenience factor has to slowly creep up. And now we have to give up on some of the security. So again, it's understanding that as you're adding these convenience factors of the ability to make an online transaction, you're giving up some security. And it's our job to understand what's that gap in security that we're now giving up in order to get that convenience, and what additional controls can we put in place, whether from a preventative side or a detective side, in order to accommodate for that gap that we just now increase. So it's really all about understanding and measuring how much security are we giving up, and is it necessary in order to gain that particular convenience. So it's striking that right balance. Everything can be encrypted. We can have 100% encrypted of everything at rest, everything in transit. So and everything in memory. But the problem is number one, that's incredibly expensive, and it's also going to be incredibly slow. So now we have to give up. Well, we're only going to put certain things in a SGX chip or a confidential computer, secure element, trusted execution environment, whatever word you want to use. So now we're going to pick and choose what types of the executions are we going to be putting in this trusted execution environment, so that way it's encrypted, in memory. And then we're also going to decide from a cost perspective, well, what do we actually want to encrypt at rest? And also, what do we want to encrypt in transit? So again, in theory, from a technological perspective, everything can be 100% encrypted at all time, including while processing. Strict zero trust model. This is something that you can adopt, and I would recommend not necessarily a strict zero trust, but I think we need to shift a little bit back more towards zero trust. Now, I'm old enough that when I started technology, things and networks and devices that were sitting on your internal network were trusted. So we didn't necessarily take this approach where if you're sitting on the inside of the network, I want to block this particular host from talking to this particular host. It was generally assumed that if you're on your network, I can see all the devices. When I started working, I could very easily just run a scan and see every single device that's sitting on my internal network. Well, we have to take a zero trust model, not only with our internal network, but the way we work with certain vendors, even cloud providers. So this is something that I would definitely tell people that they really need to start thinking about from a zero trust perspective. Excessive personnel security measures. This goes into the insider threats. This is something that's really hard to protect against, especially for smaller organizations that don't have the ability to take a particular task and shard it out, if you will, to multiple different people. So now you have trusted individuals within your network or within your organization that have access to not only access to your customers, have access to your internal processes, have access to, potentially backups to certain things. So this is something that I think that most of the organizations that we work with really have to take, more of, to give more attention to. Full redundancy from a resiliency perspective. I can't tell you how many organizations that I've spoke to or worked with, whether it was at my seat at some of the largest, financial institutions or at Galaxy, or, even just talking to certain prospects, at Halborn, is, from a resiliency perspective within the architecture of their offering, there's multiple holes of single point of failures. Now, this isn't necessarily a cyber per se, it could be in the sense of a denial of service attack, to bring down an organization. So that was really the nexus here for the cybersecurity discussion. But building in the resiliency and full redundancy into the architecture also costs money. Also, there is technological debt that comes with that, and now having to hire multiple different staffs. Am I going to take my architecture and replicate it across multiple different cloud providers? Again, continuous audits and penetration testing. This is an area that I obviously, coming from Halborn, have a particular interest in, because I think a lot of organizations look at audits, unfortunately, as optics. Their clients are asking for it. It's great to say that we've got an audit or an assessment. I hate the word audit, by the way, an assessment from a particular organization. But what the community doesn't realize is that assessment was a point in time. So organization comes in, does an assessment, we look at the vulnerability. So now there's two issues with this. One is, in theory, these assessments or reports should expire after 3 to 6 months, because there are new attack vectors that weren't necessarily tested against, or new vulnerabilities that have been discovered against a particular layer 1 protocol that wasn't necessarily known to the community. So though, even if the code hasn't changed, the attack vectors and the learnings of the different threat actors have expanded over time, so they should be re-audited. The other piece is, all of these projects are constantly changing code. So as a community, if you're looking and you see, oh, it's been audited, look at what was audited. Look at which smart contract. Look at the hash of the repo, not to get too technical, but look at what was actually audited versus what you're actually interacting with today. Chances are what was been audited is not necessarily what's been rolled out into production, because a lot of organizations have not necessarily adopted this continuous audit and penetration test. It's being done more for optics, security theater, to tell the community, hey, we've engaged with a certain firm, but again, not necessarily done from part of a comprehensive security strategy. Now, I mentioned before, I wanted to talk about a particular hack and what could have been prevented. And, this is a very interesting one, because it's hailed as one of the most sophisticated hacks, that happened last year. This is the Ronin hack. The one piece that I wanted to talk about was the social engineering aspect of it. Now, while yes, that was a very well orchestrated social engineering attack, if you're not familiar, I'll just break it down very simply. What they did was the threat actor created an online LinkedIn profile for a recruiter at Coinbase. They spent the time over a period of time in order to build out this profile to make it look legitimate, by adding work histories, by adding pictures, by connecting with multiple people within Coinbase. So from the outside world looking at this particular profile, it's connected to hundreds of people within Coinbase. They have a work history, there's recommendations, there's pictures. It looks like a legitimate profile. So they then sent a LinkedIn message to a particular person within the target organization, and they told them that they liked their profile. They want to interview them for manager of engineering. So right there, that's the incentive. Hey, here's a higher up position for potentially a larger organization, more reputable organization. That attracted that person. They responded. They went through about 3 to 5 different Zoom interviews, walked through like a regular job interview, over the course of a couple of weeks, called them up, presented them with a job offer. The person accepted. They said, great, we're going to send you an offer letter. They sent them the offer letter. They opened it up, and it was malware. And the that particular machine was owned. So now, yes, that was a very complicated social engineering hack, but how would that have been prevented at a large financial institution? Well, I'll tell you the 2 ways. Number one, you could not use your work laptop for personal use. So that's number one. And number two, things like LinkedIn messaging are blocked in most large financial institutions, because it's a way that you can talk to external clients that are not necessarily logged for compliance purposes. So right off the bat, if this person was interacting with this particular organization, it would not have been on a work machine or on able to access their employer's network. So it would have been cut off right there. Well, let's just say for whatever purposes that it was on the work laptop. There's enough controls, number one, from a process perspective, from a technological perspective, to stop that east and west lateral movement. So even if that machine became owned, they wouldn't have been able to move east or west laterally to own the other types of assets that they ended up owning. And then the other piece would have been, from a process perspective, this particular individual who was a developer would not have had access to a production environment. So even if they own their machine and were able to move east or west laterally with their credentials, they would not have been able to access it. So to recoup, because this was I don't want to say a smaller organization, but buttoned up financial institution with the type of controls, able to use their work laptop for personal use. You had somebody who had more access than they should have. And then there's not a lot of controls in place to stop that east or west lateral movement. So again, this is being hailed as one of the most sophisticated hacks, but this would never have happened in a large financial institution. So what is that, striking that right balance between security and convenience? So the first thing is, let's understand the risk profile. What are we actually trying to protect against? And I think this is where a lot of security folks and a lot of organizations drop the ball in some respect. They run to security and they run to technology in order, let's throw up firewalls, let's throw up EDR, let's throw up data loss prevention, let's do trusted execution environments, confidential compute, and IAM policies, and privileged access management systems. All those things are good, but you have to understand what you're trying to protect against first in order to understand, number one, what technology you're going to use and where are you actually going to implement them. So it's important to understand that security is a function of risk management. It's really just a highly technical portion of risk management. But the fundamental tenets of risk management is, what is the risk to the organization? What controls am I putting in place? And does it effectively mitigate that risk? And if it doesn't effectively mitigate that risk, am I accepting the risk or am I adding some compensating controls on top of that? If we frame security in that lens, it makes more sense, and with limited budgets and with limited resources, we'll be focusing our attention appropriately at the right places. And it will also help us uplift our security, so that way when we understand, well, here's the risk that we're trying to protect against and here's the control that we have, when we do this iterative process where we keep looking at it, we'll understand, and that's a continuous improvement, which I'll get to in a second. We'll understand, well, hey, this control that was good 6 months ago maybe is not enough. Let's add on a secondary layer of controls, and then we can start adding on testing. So now we can say, well, is our control actually effective? We think it's effective. This is the control that we put in place. Let's test against the control. And once you start getting in that mindset, security becomes more pragmatic and it becomes more practical. Prioritizing user experience. Now, again, this is what I brought up before with the user experience. Users should be educated to the point that security should feel transparent to the user. They shouldn't realize what they're going through, because once you start putting up these roadblocks, clients and employees will find ways around it. A quick story: when I was working at some banks in my past history, we used to have work phones and we used to have our personal phones. And when we went out for lunch, nobody wanted to carry both phones with us because that's just generally annoying. So I would watch people would go and they would forward their work email to their personal email while they stepped away. Now, again, we have controls in place that would stop this at the gateway. So this is, I'm dating myself, but that just shows once you put up too much resistance to accessing certain information, people are going to try to find ways around it. So let's prioritize the user experience to the point where we're securing our users, but it should feel transparent to it. Adaptive security, I think, is something that we can do a better job of in Web3. That is very much in use in traditional finance. So adaptive security is raising and lowering security measures based on the risk. And the quickest example of this is, when you call into a bank and you have to authenticate yourself, by the time you call in, they already have a profile of what phone number you're calling in from, what region you're calling in from, is it within the normal calling patterns of what you call in from. They have voice recognition. So the second you start talking to a customer service rep, they have a confidence score of, is this David that I'm talking to, or is this potentially not David? And then if it's not David, let me ask these additional security questions. And for very, very confident David, maybe we'll only ask this one question. So by doing adaptive security, you're creating a better user experience, but you're also increasing the security, because now we can have those multiple layers of controls, but we'll only use it when our confidence score is low. Leveraging low friction technologies, using biometrics to a point, using single sign-on, using secure enclaves. This goes back to prioritizing those user experience. By using these low friction technologies, it's adding on additional layers of controls and additional layers of security that don't burden the users. Continuous improvement, this is a big deal that I think also a lot of organizations can really step up. Is what was good yesterday is not good for today, and it's definitely not what's good for tomorrow. All of the tools and information and resources that we have, the threat actors have access to it as well. All the monitoring capabilities that we have, they have access to it as well. So they can run their own simulated tests against environments that they know that we have stood up to see, have we bypassed this particular detection technique. So understand that this is a cat and mouse game, unfortunately, and that we have to continuously improve. It's the concept of Kaizen, just constantly improving. Learning from other industries. What are the banks doing? What is Amazon doing? What are the large retail companies doing? They have the budgets. They've been around the block many times. They are heavily regulated from a security perspective. So we can borrow. Don't just go to crypto conferences. Go to RSA, go to Black Hat, go to the traditional cybersecurity conferences to understand what are the new techniques that are being implemented in the bank, and see if there's a way that we can, from a lower cost, implement either those types of controls or those types of technologies. And the other piece is collaboration. It's very well done in the TradFi world, where you have FSISAC, information sharing. We as a community need to gather and start sharing information. When I was working in TradFi, if a particular bank was seeing a particular type of attack or IP addresses that they were unknown that they saw was doing a port scan, for example, all of that information was shared with the rest of the financial services industry, so they can look for it, so they can either proactively block it, or they can do information sharing to see, is this a coordinated attack against multiple financial services institutions, or is this maybe a drive-by? So thank you everybody for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, or you have Rob, our CEO's contact information on the bottom. But thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for presentation. It was the biggest amount of information I've ever heard for 20 minutes, and it was really useful. And I think about what we can do as a media to increase the level of security. And I found one item in your presentation. It's education and awareness programs as a media we can do. Because I guess that most of security issues are coming from basic, not knowing the just basic of security, and that is why the awareness programs and education is the best we can do from ourselves, and invite such experts as you to tell people how else they can secure their funds, their wallets, and so on and so forth. And my question is concerning the Web3 in Ukraine, because our main idea of this conference is to boost Web3 in Ukraine. And I understand that mass adoption, which you were talking about, which is coming from big security, less convenience, so this stuff. So how we can boost Web3 in Ukraine despite the education and awareness programs?
So two things. One is I truly believe that security can be a differentiator for a project. There's a lot of projects that are offering higher yield as a way to attract users onto it. But I think we're seeing a fundamental shift in what people want. People want security. They want to know that their assets are safe. So I think if there's projects in the Ukraine that are looking to build or looking to figure out ways, how can I differentiate them myself against somebody else, maybe focus on security, not as an afterthought necessarily, but part of the product itself. So again, cryptocurrency, is cryptographic. So security is digital ledger technology. It's intertwined. So utilize the aspect of digital ledger technology and cryptocurrency and security as a way to help differentiate the projects. The other piece is, cybersecurity. There's a tremendous, not only is there a lack of talent in the Web2 world, there's a huge lack of talent in the Web3 world. So there's a number of opportunities to fill in the gaps of where we're missing. Like I mentioned, incident response. I have not necessarily seen a fully fleshed out security operations center that provides incident response, not from an on-chain forensic perspective, like a chain analysis, but more for an on-chain incident response for I've been breached. So I think that's another huge opportunity that, could be stood up in the Ukraine as well. But those are probably the two areas that I think is not addressed today in Web3 that is open for someone to take.
Okay, and the second thing I think can be work is to have built-in security with the help of such projects as Halborn, to set the level of startups from the very beginning to build in this security. And I guess guys like you can help our startups to do that.
100%. What I find in the Web3 world, and especially in the cybersecurity world, everybody wants this to succeed. We want to see the proliferation of cryptocurrency. Everybody's willing to help. For projects that don't necessarily have can say afford a Halborn or afford one of our competitors, I'm happy to spend hours on the phone with them and giving them setting them in the right direction, making introductions potentially for other firms that they can work with. So I would implore anybody that has any questions, feel free to reach out to me personally. Again, I unofficially advise many different projects that aren't necessarily at the stage of fully launching. Just because I believe in the technology and I believe in the mission, and I know everybody else in the community wants to give back. So I would just tell everybody, reach out to myself on LinkedIn, reach out to, even our competitors. We'll all be willing to help and guide you in that right direction, because it only benefits everybody if things are built securely.
Yeah, tomorrow we will host a pitch session for startups, and I hope when the war will finish, you will come to Ukraine and be in person in judges or partners
I would
and
love
help
to.
the Ukrainian startups to build in this security. Thank you for being with us. It was very interesting, and I advise people who don't speak English so good as David to watch it again and pause on the slides and read them, because it's really great information in them. Thanks for being with us. You're always welcome in Ukraine. Waiting for you here.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.
Take care.